First and foremost, let me say it is indeed an honor to be here. I really appreciate that first overview of networks and networking, and I love the title, Addressing Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And this is very powerful because the issue that we have been fighting for is building that pipeline, that environmental pipeline, or that pipeline of justice. It's not only enough to fight for and seek environmental justice and call for diversity, but it's also important that we try to build that pipeline. I think what's also missing from this network here, there should be leaders of Congress here, or their staffs, especially at least the CBC. You are right now in the place where it really matters, because our laws and our regulations that protect our air, our water, our soils are legislated right here. All the rulemaking, all the policy giving and or taking, or the dismantling is occurring right here. It's definitely important to have networks, diversity in the outfield, but at the center of power is very, very critical. So I want to thank you for at least highlighting that slide. And I want to add a little thing. There was that slide that had the cluster of one cluster above and below, and they had the bridge in the middle. And so when we talk about racism and the impacts of racism and discrimination, that bridge, you know, that allowed people to build those networks, you add also and factor in race. It's not just education and or ability. Because when I grew up in the 60s, in northern Westchester and traveled, we had something called the Bad Air Fund. The Fresh Air Fund was something where urban kids in urban centers would go to the rural or, as I said, green spaces of their regions or their country or their state, enjoy, as I say, fresh air, because a lot of urban areas burn coal and a lot of carbon emissions triggered asthma, etc. But since I grew up in northern Westchester, a place called Peekskill, New York, where they had the Peekskill riots with Paul Robeson, I might touch on that later on. We went from Peekskill to Harlem. So that's where my father was, where my grandmother was, where my nan. So we went and coughed our whole summer away. But because of segregation, the access of people of color to green, fresh, and open spaces were very, very limited. But more importantly, even in building this environmental justice movement, the opportunities were limited. And it wasn't until that famous study, Toxic Waste and Race, that connected the dots, that basically allowed us to realize that we are part of a phenomenon, that we started to come together in taking our various incidents that we were struggling against and started to network and, as I say, to build a movement. But anyway, I won't bore you anymore with that. Oh, this is the little slide. I'm looking for something to punch. So when we talk about standing on the shoulders of giants, and a lot of folks say, well, it's cliche to have Dr. King. How many people know that when Dr. King was in Memphis, that he was there, A, for a labor strike, but specifically garbage men, sanitation workers. And it was actually because of labor conditions that a sanitation worker was crushed in the back of a garbage truck. How many here know about the communities in Memphis to this day? Like Flint, A, had serious hazardous environmental conditions, and they were second and third class communities, even within their own communities. Handling hazardous waste. Around Memphis is a lot of petrochemicals and pesticides industry. They have some of the oldest legacy for farm pesticides manufactured right there, and literally all of the black communities are built right upon these facilities, and the effluent and the plumes and the discharges are going right into their community. So not only was this a struggle for justice for workers, this was a struggle for justice, not only for the education, because these people were dealing with segregated education, but this was also a struggle for justice for their living environment. They went from slaves to workers to second-class citizens, all within that community, but also dying deaths of cancer, asthma, to this day, still unremedied. And how many people realize that this is what that community, that Memphis strike, crystallized many things at the heart of that civil rights movement. We call it intersectionality. There are a lot of things that were cross-cutting at that instant. Now today, to swallow that history, we gloss over Dr. King, and many of you probably during elementary school would like, oh, he fought for civil rights, and he fought for black people to have freedom. Let's be clear. This is not for black people to have freedom. He fought for civil rights. There's no such thing as black rights, white rights, Hispanic rights, Native American rights. Civil rights is basically according all the laws and protections that are within our Constitution and laws of the land to all people, regardless of color. A lot of people get it twisted. You know, they say, oh, affirmative action is about giving black people preference. No, it is not. It is about justice. It's about that network diagram that for over 300 years, because of your race, color, or creed, whether you're First Nation, Native American, or Forced Nation, African American, you were locked out of the advancement in the society, the wealth in the society that was extracted from raw materials from lands that are protected, were once Native Americans, or by the hands of Forced Nations. You were denied even any ounce of that wealth because of your race, ethnicity, and origin, and regardless of your, as I say, your presence here. So when Dr. King, that giant, you know, he stood upon the shoulder and legacy of countless thousands before him, but specifically, one of the things that he recognized, that even later that John Mair recognized, that we're all connected. We have this inescapable mutuality. We cannot advance somebody at the expense of another human being. We cannot advance even humanity at the expense of the environment. We cannot advance as they say, a so-called intelligent species without recognizing that everything is connected. Not just the people, our land, our air, our water, our soil, all these things are connected. This is a man who spoke in the terms of the book of Genesis, because people say, well, he was a Christian, but yes, the book of Genesis is the book of creation. And one of the things that struck him was man as a steward of creation, not a despoiler, not an exploiter, but preserving creation, because through preserving creation, again, this is what slaves and farmers on the land, through stewardship, you protected the land for the next generation. It was not something to be liquidated to exhaustion and at the expense of humanity and at the expense of creation. There was that implicit symbiotic relationship. So when he spoke on many, many levels. So in looking at him, you look at the deepness and depth of what he stood for in his perspective. But the same thing is also true with John Mair. He came to that other conclusion. This is where I would disagree with my sister Dorcita about the need just, only folks with credentials can be respected. And but this again, you're seeing one is a doctor, PhD educated doctor, granted theology, but the other guy beneath him, how many people don't realize that he's just a polymath? He had no degree. He was recognized by Joe LeConte because of his natural curiosity that through just, as I say, having that natural learning, he developed and came upon some awarenesses and some expertise with regards to geology that made him a natural scholar. And they honored him accordingly. So I say that to say this, do not assume because you go into underdeveloped communities and because they don't have a university education that their local knowledge and their local expertise is second class. A lot of the breakthroughs in pharmacology is basically Americans and Europeans going into third world nations, going to native tribes, into African tribes, studying ancient traditions of healing and medicinal herbs. And then what they do with their high-end knowledge is they distill out the active agents in that herb and they get new medicines. But do you think they give the communities patent rights? Now all of a sudden there are communities in Latin America and Africa that cannot use regimens and treatment regimens because now an international patent has been issued on their expertise that is now they become alienated from. So the thing is that part of justice and inclusion is basically restoring that, hey, there is a shared contribution by all of us and that all these things are connected. And that a lot of our processes often disconnect us, but now it's coming together in awareness. One of the things that where we are right now with regards to the environmental movement is focusing upon diversity, equity, inclusion. But before we begin to do that, a lot of folks don't realize, because the person says, what does this have to do? Because I always got this question as an environmental activist. you know, what does civil rights and all that stuff have to do with environmentalism? You know, why are we dealing with racism when we have to focus on conservation or species protection, etc.? A lot of folks don't realize that the environmentalist movement or the conservation movement or the naturalist movement, and also the disciplines of anthropology, okay, etc., come from the naturalists, historian naturalists, and early conservationists, of which Louis Agassiz, who is the mentor of Joe LeConte, who is the guy who discovered John Muir, was what they call a naturalist or natural historian. And they were the ones that came up with categorizing all the flora and fauna and plants and species. And they did not stop with animals and plants. They also classified and categorized races. One of the early underpinnings of the conservation movement, and why Sierra Club was exclusive, and a lot of environmental organizations and naturalist movements were exclusive, was because they believed that whites genetically were a superior species. In fact, when we talk about eugenics, the eugenic movement goes right actually into this earlier naturalist movement. So you go into the people, and so your scholarship, you have to do deep scholarship. One of the things that I've done since I've been in this movement, in leading the call for diversity, equity, inclusion, I had to teach the movement about itself, and truly about its place. And that the reason why you see today modern conservationists, environmentalists try to focus on the narrow is because they want to forget the legacy of the past, that a lot of the environmental racism and injustice is anchored in an ideology that they help foster and create when we talk about institutional racism. And so connecting this entire movement with its legacy, its true legacy, because Joe LeConte was one of our nation's leading eugenicists. And here's another thing that's in that box. That, you know, his works are what also inspired a guy called Adolf Hitler and a lot of other xenophobes of their day. It was the state-of-the-art science, you know, that we are the center of the earth and all things lesser are inferior. And so one of the issues that we have to deal with when we talk about finding out and the need for diversity and equity is not new. It's about cleaning up the old. Think about that. It's not about, this is not a new wave. This is not about, you know, something that's fanciful and it's a new fad in which we're now, with national politics, you see people so-called pushing back. No, they're not pushing back. They call themselves conservatives for a reason. It's like the conservation movement. They want to go back to that old model or old network where race, class, and caste stratified, separated, and excluded for the benefit of one race over the other. And it's an irrational nonsense, but back in the day, it was state-of-the-art science. It was science that justified policies, codes, norms, and values. Who got land, who didn't get land, who were put on reservations and who weren't. Native Americans were taken from their lands. Aboriginal people within Australia were shackled or as I say, forced re-educated one way. They were, again, based upon a European definition of superiority in Eurocentric world. Their movement and their stewardship of not only the land, air, and soil, but even stewardship over the lesser and inferior races was a critical hallmark of early discrimination within what would, you know, be, as say, is the foundational bedrock of the conservation and naturalist movement. So when we talk about environmental conservation, when we talk about a lot of the science and stuff that's behind us, we need to know what the antecedents are. You know, again, the past is never really the past. It is always present. Think about that. Those folks, when they did their march in Charlottesville, were talking about a nostalgic vision of old supremacy. The past is always present. And so the issue currently is how do we force to build that new direction, and how do we force to shape and change the movement? We have a number of choices. You can tear it down. But the other piece, the legacy, again, of Dr. King, and even of John Muir, is knowing what the power of our democracy and our civil society, and that being a nation of laws, then it's an issue of representation, and critical to representation, that is of literacy and then how do we become literate about our democracy, and how do we become active and change agents within that democracy. And one of the things that I did when I became part of this environmental movement was to marry actively and intentionally the civil rights as well as the environmental rights. In other words, you have a civil right to clean air. You have a civil right to clean water. You have a civil right to clean soil. And that was such a powerful thing that the environmental justice movement brought out. For the first time in its history, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce actually created something called the National Black Chamber of Commerce. And that was to deal with the environmental justice movement to push that back. Think about it. Think about what happens to laws and regulations when it's no longer, permitted based upon what they call it, with the TMDLs, which is your total maximum daily loads of anything that can be emitted into air, water, and soil. When you're saying that a human being has a human right or civil right to clean air, clean water, clean soil, it's no longer what a polluter can then discharge into that. And so from their eyes, they saw the environmental justice movement by fusing civil rights laws and civil rights, as I say, case law, as a tool for fighting for clean air and clean water and clean soil, because minority communities and Hispanic communities and Native American communities were disproportionately affected, that posed a real danger. Because now the judge is not going to get into, what's allowable, but the question becomes, does this human being have a right to have his air, water, and soil protected? Do they have a right to clean air, clean water, clean soil? And so there, it presented new challenges. So all of a sudden you see the institution responding back by all of a sudden financing something that it historically discriminated against, basically black businessmen and women, Hispanic business, people of color owning businesses, to now creating something, but not to expand corporate franchise and business opportunity within these communities, but as a tool to fight against those pushing back against, as they say, racist regulations that were putting our communities disproportionately at harm and at risk. And so by making those powerful linkages and, as I say, reinventing and reinvigorating the movement, we had created some very significant pushback. And one of the things that you see here is that, one of the things in fighting for the movement was also fighting for the health of our democracy, linking that our right to voting franchise, civil rights, as I say, the new Voting Rights Act, would allow people of color to actually elect policy and legislators that would actually create regulation that will be protective of them in their environment. But to do that, you have to have a healthy democracy. And this is one of the things that we had to link, and again, building upon Dr. King's work and building upon his norms, building upon the norms of It's All Connected by John Mair, we were building something and still are building something very powerful by which all of you being here are a direct and intentional byproduct of that work. So one of the things in fighting for these things, you got to look at what's broken down and why people settle for, as I say, living in dirty environments, or environments that are, as I say, not performing for them in ways that can elevate them but to detract. Well, one of the conditions, as I talked about, Dr. King fought for labor, and we are hearing about the fight for 15. But what was one of the critical outcomes of the most recent election? The critical outcome, what they used, was the poor coal miner in West Virginia, and how the coal miners in West Virginia were against Obama and Democrats. Now they make it sound, they cut it off at that level, but what the real story is that when humanity is reduced to such a degraded state for a wage, that they're willing to sacrifice their life, limb, wealth, and future generations just to earn that wage. It's not bad on them. It is because their government and political structure is controlled such that they don't have that power to change it. And so what happens is, as you see, whether it's in West Virginia or even in developing nations, those nations that don't have the networks, that don't have access to the power or means to change their status, they're locked into economic dependencies that force them to perpetuate a polluting or carbon culture. So by pushing for minimum wage laws, and again, a healthy democracy that forces minimum wage laws, or pushes for green technology, or transition to clean and alternative energy, and funds it, as they say, the way they fund incentives for gas pipelines, or fracking wells, that you can absolutely transform an economic sector. Look, in fact, it turns upon its head the myth that the private sector creates jobs. I disagree. As FDR proved with his massive investments, okay, during World War II, in priming the economic pump, and pouring money into Detroit, what made the auto industry was actually, before it was the tank industry and the plane industry. That primed the economy. So government, through massive investment, it creates the incentive that then creates the base by which private sector jobs are built, and then it spins off from there. And that is also true if we take government investment in clean energy. Think about right now. The entire eastern seaboard and Gulf states could be actually energy independent if we did a dollar for dollar swap out. Instead of offshore gas rigs, we swapped them out for offshore wind. Think about that. And we then restructured the regulatory requirements that put the benefits on clean energy and renewables versus investing in incentives that keep dirty energy coming in. We can transform it overnight. And then people go, that's pipe dreams. I go, it's nonsense. It's the same way this guy went in, irrespective of the needs of children that need better paid teachers in Oklahoma and Nevada, and textbooks, or the people and the children in Flint, Michigan needing an entirely new water supply that just recently got cut off with regards to the bottles that were supposed to be coming for while they're transitioning their pipelines. Instead of them investing in the people, what are we investing? $150 billion for a border wall. That is the power, and where people do disconnect the power of your politics, of our healthy democracy, in shaping the legislative framework, that it's a power of choices. And those who right now currently on that throwback choice, they want to go back to a paradigm that has defined people of color, coming from what kind of nations? Don't be afraid, you're grown. What has your president called nations of color? I can't hear you. Thank you. Don't be afraid of that. But look at what he has defined us. And again, how you get revenge. Don't get mad, as former President Obama says. You don't get mad. You what? Vote. No, you vote. You don't get mad. You take it. And this is where, like I said, and remember, one of the pet peeves, when I grew up, the first thing they were telling my guys, like my dad, former World War II vets that came home with the GI Bill, who were trying to get in to get their free education, like all their fellow white GIs, but were denied. Listen, you got to get qualified. But what we'll do is we'll give you a job. My dad, he ended up in the UAW, United Auto Workers, and he ended up in General Motors, and this was his little GI Bill job. And because of redlining in New York State, and specifically in New York City, by people like Fred Trump, again, the Trump family business was built on a federal program of guaranteed housing. Okay, so they basically built housing for GIs. It was money transferred from the government to real estate developers. That money, that GI Bill money at the end of World War II, built almost all of the major real estate old families in this country, building GI Bill housing. It wasn't money that they came out through genius of their investment as real estate developers. It was financed, funded, and capitalized by the federal government. But guys like my father, in spite of fighting for freedom, he ended up in housing, as they say, in northern Westchester, sort of like Blazing Saddles. You had to circle your own wagon. So we could not live in New York City, so we ended up in northern Westchester. That's how we ended up there. Him, a lot of his GI brothers and sisters that had served out of Harlem. And that's why, by the way, Paul Robeson ended up coming to Peekskill and visiting Peekskill, because a lot of that Harlem left, and those labor organizers lived up there. That's why Pete Seeger settled up there. By the way, Pete Seeger is the guy that wrote the anthem of the civil rights movement, We Shall Overcome. But it was that early solidarity forced out of New York City, and Harlem particularly, to places like Westchester County. And so it didn't stop them from organizing, it just gave them another place to organize. But the cool thing was, I grew up in this beautiful Hudson Highland environment. So when people say, how did you come to the environment? I says, well, not only did I grow up in a beautiful place that was very special, but also had a long, lengthy family history. And so one of the things I want to get to when I talk about Fred Trump, and when I talk about the laws and regulating our land, everything, this is why democracy is critical and important. Everything is tied to the land, and that land is controlled by our government. All land use decisions on how we live and use that land, it's all controlled by regulation. So when we talk about Dr. King, the civil rights movement, it's not an abstract thing about blacks, it's about having access to the laws, regulations, and policies that allow you to have equitable distribution of benefits, as well as dealing with negative amenities. That it doesn't end up because your race is black and you're not sophisticated or understanding about your system, that you end up with all the negative amenities, but all the positive amenities like parks end up over in the white area. So it's about not being mad, but being literate. And this is the thing about why we need more diversity within the conservation movement, what's why movements like this right here, building that justice pipeline, is not the one-off of my generation coming off of civil rights and building the environmental justice movement, but now preparing another, like Sister Dorcita, preparing another generation to take delivery. And another critical piece to this is not only just on the active end, because again, racism is always financed. As I pointed out how Donald Trump's dad, Fred Trump, got the contracts and the bills to redline and decide where people can live or not based upon racial covenants. The foundations that finance justice, the foundations that finance movements like this, that finance diversity, this is part of that justice paradigm. Not only having young folks that are ready to step into that paradigm, but having the fuel and the resources that finance that justice and finance the next level of leadership, so that this stuff just doesn't happen again. You know, we're not going to eradicate it, but you need to understand what happens and why it happens. So everything from land use planners, as you say, from county legislators, planning boards, you will find yourself in an array of any of these things. But what really is critical is that, we heard about something called Cambridge Analytica. How many of you have heard about Cambridge Analytica? Good. And what Cambridge Analytica deals with is, and like what I deal with, is big data. And that's that little thing in the middle. Because when you talk about policies and laws and how things are cited, they actually play upon various demographics and various variables. In fact, everything from surveys to the census, and they come up with profiles of people and community, okay? And from that profile, they can absolutely steer, as I say, not only where people live, but where certain things happen, but also who is most likely or least likely to resist. So when you talk about a project that usually ends up in a poor community, they know very well the community will not have the tools. So that's why the demographics and the income variable and the education variables matter. And so when they decide that the neighborhoods are going to be the path of least resistance, that's where they start citing stuff. This is why, for example, the sewage treatment plant in Manhattan is up in Harlem Heights, not in Lower Manhattan, down where the former Speaker of the New York State Assembly, Mr. Sheldon Silver, lived. Think about it. They built a sewage treatment plant, a massive sewage treatment for the entire Manhattan and also parts of the Bronx and other New York City areas, piping it uphill to that sewage treatment plant. And so it shows you that why? Well, the community of Harlem, their big thing was that they wanted more youth recreation opportunities. And so what they did to do that, they built the state-of-the-art recreation facilities, sports facilities, community meeting spaces and facilities, and they gave the community that. And the community was happy, but it was all built on top of one of the country's largest sewage treatment plants. And it triggered a whole outbreak of asthma. That's where West Harlem Environmental Action was born. That was where Bernice Miller Travis, Peggy Shepard, that was the core piece of their movement. In fact, I go back when I was fighting by incinerator, in 87, when Bernice was a graduate student, and Charles Lee was a graduate student, and Dr. Ben Chavis, again, with the United Church of Christ. And this is a very critical, pivotal point. But the nature and disposition of a community determine where things happen. And this is another reason why a failed democracy and the little people who were susceptible because of their demographic values, how that can be exploited by the society is a critical piece. And that's why you got to look at these things and not look at them apart from. This is not about, the next generation of conservationists are going to be the folks that are going to be dealing with the wilderness and, as they say, national parks. No, they deal with all issues relative to air, land, water, and soil. And you may end up in National Park Service, but you may more likely end up in some regional planning board. Some of you may get a law degree and you'll become environmental attorneys, and you might end up working for Exxon or some carbon company. But the point of the matter is, if you do, at least now you know the jig is up, because people now are advocating and organizing against that type of activity. But it took the environmental justice movement to get to this level of expertise and pedagogy so that it would be training the next level of line of professionals. A lot of this was born in the community before it became educational disciplines at the universities where people are now getting PhDs on. So how did I come to this issue? My journey, as I talked about, again, how land use is decided, again, how people's socioeconomic and demographic variables are determined to cite something in the community. So, a little story about how I came to the movement. A little bit about me, as many of you know, that I'm a spatial epidemiologist with the New York State Department of Health. The state of New York is my employer, the governor of the state of New York is my big boss. When I came to that community, again, I gave you a little bit about my background, son of a UAW organizer, etc. And one of the reasons why I decided to live in the community of Arbor Hill, that community of Arbor Hill is right here, is right where that big cloud I circled around. The reason why I came to that community is that, like any place you go, you have choices. I just figured that since, here I am with a fella that's fresh out of the Navy in graduate school, and my wife had just completed her master's in teaching, we want to settle not in a suburban community, but in urban communities where we can contribute, i.e. give back. And so we figured that we could build a house there just as well as we can build in the suburbs. And so what we did, again, using our background, we looked for places that would be great to build, so we found a nice nature preserve, and we built our house right up on the edge of that nature preserve. Little did we know that it was going to be in the prevailing wind pattern of a plume of smoke that would come from a waste-to-energy incinerator. Does anybody know what a solid waste-to-energy incinerator is? In short, they burn garbage. And they burn garbage for an upstate 8-county region. This is the capital of the state of New York. It's called Albany, New York. It doesn't have a laser pointer, does it?
No.
Well, I'll project. Right here is the Capitol complex. My office is right here, Corning Tower. The governor's mansion is just right over here. This is Capitol Hill, and this is Arbor Hill. In the middle where they put this plant that is state-of-the-art technology is called Sheridan Hollow. So again, we can talk about science and technology, because one of the things that they do when they plan things, they talk about engineering controls, and when they're selling something, it's got to conform with certain standards. So it was state-of-the-art technology. But the point is, it was state-of-the-art technology if you were putting it out in the Oklahoma plains, a massive stack that was about 10 stories high, that in a hollow, it was actually beneath the high grades of Capitol Hill and Arbor Hill. So think of it as a hat. In the center of the hat, the bowl of the hat, you put a plant that you can't see the top of the stack. And up on the edges or the brim of the hat, you have communities. To the south was the state workers, and to the north is a predominantly African American and Hispanic community. 2 elementary schools, a middle school, so children going from K through to 8 would be in the chronic point of exposure of this plant. Now, I did not know this. I just built my house, and all I know is that right after we built it, we moved in. Like any family, the first thing you do is you have a cookout. And, and I noticed black stuff coming all over my food. I said, and it wasn't pepper. And I said, what the heck is going on? And that was our first incident. And every morning I noticed that there was a film and coating of ash and white soot on everything. And so, you tend to be innocuous about, what is this stuff? So you're dusting off your car. But long and short of it, my daughters developed after about a year of chronic exposure of what's something called environmental asthma. Environmental asthma is when you have asthma symptoms and you have no history of asthma in your family. Now remember I told you I had the Bad Air Fund? And so even when I and my sisters and brothers went down to Manhattan during the days when you literally had trash burning in every building, coal burning, and soot was everywhere because they had their bad air. You get some nice pictures of New York City in 1964 through like 1970 before the Clean Air Act. I mean, it looked like London fog, or the bad days that you see with the China Olympics, where they had the clouds of smog rolling in. So even within those conditions, none of us came down with coughing fits or as I say, breathing difficulty. And so I didn't have any legacy or history in my family, neither did my wife and hers. And so when the doctors, after we were interviewing, they said, well, there's something that is triggering this within your daughters. And one of the things that we noticed is that when our daughters were at the doctors or away from them, wherever we had to go out of town, their symptoms would decrease or would not be as bad. But it's really significant when you start to notice your children's health going down. So as a health professional, I started going door to door in my community and seeing if there were other residents in the community that were, having the same symptoms. And lo and behold, I recognized that other residents, other families were having this issue. So being a public health professional, naturally I get up my pad, and I get a few other neighbors, I organize a committee, and I said, listen, let's find out what's going on here and do some observations. And then in going door to door, basically, residents start to communicate. Look, how am I doing in time? Okay. But just give me the fist for the 5. Oh, I gotta go fast then. Give me 10. So long and short of it is that we organized, and not only did we find that there was asthma, we were finding people that were talking about autoimmune diseases and increased incidence of autoimmune diseases. We also found people were dying of cancer. Now a lot of folks, well, listen, I know there's many causes and triggers, but something called clusters where you have just an unusually high amount. And so while you cannot actually have a direct association to the stat, one of the things that I did do was once I did my community, I then went to other parts of the city and asked and did as a reference point, as a control. So based upon my informal study with control, I found something very unusual happening in my community. But also, another thing happened. My house wasn't even 3 years old before all the paint started to pit and peel, also on my car. So that was an indication of what? High sulfur dioxide. So sulfur dioxide on a cool morning with a lot of moisture coming from the Hudson River, as the Hudson River, what's it become? Sulfuric acid. And so that's what is a huge lung irritant, but also it destroys your property, and it's just bad stuff. It's just like on top of everything else. And so I said, what is the cause? The long and short of it was that we noticed that this plume, where's this plume coming from? They go, well, it's the incinerator. It's always been like that. So the long and short of it, I said, well, how did this incinerator get placed here? Well, that's when I learned about the whole planning process in which they surveyed the community and said, well, this was the best place that they could site the incinerator. And I went back and I reviewed the minutes and I discussed with people over how they permit this and how the community come to embrace this incinerator. Well, a little bit more about Arbor Hill. The median income was about $12,500, and majority of the households, single parent, female, with at least 2 to 3 children. So when you got a poor community, what do you think was the big thing that they promised that community when they were building that incinerator? Jobs. And see, when you go back to that matrix, where you find out the demography, and you may also find out the susceptibility. Okay? So demography, and again, that like Cambridge Analytics. So they say, well, okay, we can promise them this, and we can get community buy-in. So you got these old photos of these community meetings with people, from the community here looking like they're happy, because in a community that's starving economically, like West Virginia, when you promise it, what? Jobs? It got even better. Since the plant produced energy or electricity, what do you think also they were promised? Free electricity. Reduced rate electricity. What's one of the biggest bills to poor people next to rent? Electricity, your electric bill. So if you get in mind they're going to get jobs and lower a big household expense, that means more discretionary income for their children, they're going to become champions for that plan. And it's not just the black community, but poor communities are always become champions. You see them out there pleading for it. You see offshore riggers saying, don't take away our jobs. We need more drilling. We need more pipelines, more oil. It's not that this is something that, it's what they know. It's an only choice. It's economic. So what they're playing upon is the economic needs of the community in order to put this in. The long and short of it is, we knew that we had to shut this down based upon the impact that it was having in our community. So this is at the height of the environmental justice movement. Charles Lee, at that particular point in time in 1987, was working on the toxic waste and race. And so as I was networking around, seeing if there were other incidents in case, that's when I learned about Charles and them doing that study down in New York City. And we all began that early dialogue. And here's the thing, because I was having an incident. West Harlem was having an incident. And when you do a study and analysis, you aggregate these things, and you discover a systematic pattern. You're connecting the dots of these incidents, and now you have something called a movement. Once you start, and this is that networking thing, once you start to connect those dots and the leaders and people who are struggling and resisting, that's when you start to, as I say, in producing this study, and by the way, it was groundbreaking, pioneering, because nobody else in the environmental movement or the mainstream concept were doing this type of analysis and cross-comparing where things are being cited and stratifying by race, income, and class. The Toxic Waste and Race study funded by the United Church of Christ is one of the most powerful, groundbreaking, most significant citizen science projects ever begun. Because it did something that was never looked at. And like I said, and the corporate and the regulatory world fell upon that study like a ton of bricks. But from that, it also gave us the power, now that we realized that there was a pattern and that our race mattered. And then when we did the research and we saw that communities of color were being impacted, we organized and mobilized to shut it down. And the long and short of it is that I won basically about $1.7 million, told my mom that I was a millionaire, you know, and it was true. And so this was the other thing, because a lot of people go in, if you think about Love Canal, win these lawsuits, and you know, they have a choice. They could either use the burden, because basically I used the community in my study and my analysis, the background, to highlight the burden. And the long and short of it, when you win, because I used the community class, I gave it all away. So my mother thought I'd lost my mind, that I gave away, did keep not one dime. Because again, this was advocacy and leveraging the community's pain and burden. I felt it immoral that I should personally profit and be able to leave. And that's the other thing, a lot of people have a success and they run off and move. Mine was to put every single nickel back in the community so that they could, and fight. But the thing is, not only did we shut down, we sued. And so again, how did I come to love the land? Again, mine is an ancient history. Mine comes upon generations of people. And again, this is where you start, determines how you stand. My ancestors, former slaves, that land is still in our family. This is in the Blue Ridge Mountains in the northwest corner of South Carolina, in Greenville, a place called Travelers Rest. At Caesar's Head, no, sorry, it's not Caesar's Head, but Caesar's Head is over to the right. I call it the mountain, now I'm having a brain fart. But the long and short of it is, that land's still in our family. So when people talk about conservationism being a white thing, our family lived in stewardship with the land, because before there was something called welfare and Social Security or whatever, it was our land, and that's why it's still in our hands to this day. And from that built generations of people realizing that you had to be stewards of the land. That stewardship stayed with me and was a very powerful asset when they came to me fighting for a defense of the community of Arbor Hill, but also being a passionate argument. But here's, again, I want to get to the thing on going back to that issue on the history of being alienated from the land. How do people, because a lot of people think that African Americans are all in urban areas, and I'll close here, because this is a very powerful point. And again, going back to settlement pattern. How many of you heard of the Great Migration from the South? Okay? And many people think the Great Migration was just only over the violence of white terrorism, which the Klan and white supremacist society, that they used as an institution, because before regulatory control, they used white supremacy to, as I say, reinforce that regulatory control, because only they controlled it, and just by the sheer will, they could actually put something on the land. But white terrorism wasn't the only tool that was used to force African Americans off the land and create Jim Crow. Jim, can you come up here? Can you read this number? This, by the way, is my ancestors' Zion McKenzie's tax bill. Yeah, bottom number.
$2,281.
Yes, $2,281. Can you read the year?
It It looks like 1880 something.
It's 1880. It's 1883.
Okay.
But it's 1880. 2000. Thank you.
Yeah.
Think about $2,281 in 1883. And that land that I stood on, that my ancestor paid those taxes. And we talk about Reconstruction, and by the way, and you had to pay your taxes in order to vote. And by the way, one of the ways that you would lose your land if you didn't pay your taxes. And even the poll tax was mandatory. Poll tax was not optional. And one of the critical things to having, that poll tax, was this trick not only was able to force blacks to lose their land because they could not afford to pay, it also stripped away their right to vote. So even though blacks were the majority in a number of counties throughout the South, this was a way, post-Civil War, how they took back the land. Was whites, again, by killing Reconstruction, they were able to then create laws and regulations that increased taxes that were forced mainly against African Americans, forcing them off the land, becoming homeless and destitute. And many of these families became vagrants. And guess what laws they passed? Jim Crow anti-vagrancy laws. So these people who were now at the end of Civil War had land, okay, and a lot of them had wages because the Union Army paid them wages for a lot of the work that they did. This is where a lot of them got their income. That wealth was immediately swiped away, again, through a democracy that was used against them. A newly so-called empowered people literally had the land. My ancestors were able to survive that, and that's this voting card. And this is why the issue of being an activist and voting rights is not something in my family with Dr. King. It's something that we literally, generationally, vigilantly had to fight for. I got stories of countless family members who lost their lives in various resistance movements throughout the South. But the critical point of having that land, and why it's to this day, was how a failed democracy was used to force people off that land. And this whole process, think about it, this is 1883. This is when Joe LeConte and them were passing their theories of eugenics. And so a lot of those laws of eugenics were used to rationalize the law to take away land from communities of color as well as First Nations. And again, these are tools, this is one of the biggest tools that forced the massive outmigration of African Americans to the South. So long and short of it, going into the EJ movement and taking that as a background, as a rule of fighting, a lot of us, once we connected those dots, we issued in 1990 a letter to all the Big Ten environmental organizations saying that if you're going to claim to speak on behalf of the environment and all humanity, then you're going to have to make space for us. You cannot speak for us. We have to be at the table, and we demand that diversity and equity and inclusion, and more importantly, we demand to be at the table. And I must say, and I'm going to cut it here, out of those 10 organizations, only the Sierra Club pretty much opened its doors. Out of all those organizations, they're still struggling with some of the basics. They should be beyond this at this particular stage. But this is where using Green 2.0 and as well as a number of other movements and tools in pushing funders saying, listen, you're going to have to lead the way in this challenge of diversity, because a lot of the environmental racism and the resistance to diversity is because you're funding old behavior and you're funding old habits that allow for, let's say, the lack of diversity within the movement. And so my piece in the Sierra Club, how I ended up in the Sierra Club, that was one, let me just get this story and I'm done. Okay, how I ended up in Sierra Club was that during that fight, while I was networking with those folks on the toxic waste and race study and working, connecting the dots with other EJ activists, when we had to litigate the fight to shut that plant down, the logical thing is to turn to the expertise of existing environmental organizations. And one of the first organizations I turned to was NYPIRG, and that organization at that time was at the forefront of Love Canal and Lois Gibbs. They turned us down. They turned us down. So my next organization I went to was the Sierra Club. That guy next to me is a co-worker. He invited me down to New York City, a 3-hour drive from the state capitol, to come down and pitch my case before the Sierra Club. Now I knew I was going to hit a home run there because it was going against solid waste. It was going against pollution, incineration. So all these things, I figured that were going to be a home run. So when I go to Manhattan, after a 3-hour drive, Roger introduces me. Every head in the room did this. Now, I figured it was because of my height. I said, yeah, I'm a big dude. That can like, like a lot of people, and so I get. But it wasn't until after I did my presentation that the first question that I was asked amongst many that went along this path was, did you contact or reach out to the NAACP? And that's when I realized that turn of the head really was about my color. And that was a critical point, in the mid-90s, that I knew that I was not going to get the support, but having the added humiliation of basically saying amongst white environmentalists that were in that room was that when it came to equal protection of environmental law, even their values, my color mattered. And this is before the studies of the toxic waste and risk was circulating. So that long ride back was a real long ride back. So imagine Roger was constantly apologizing, for his people. I go, listen, man, don't worry about it. I says, it's all right. I said, I thanked him for at least getting me to the door to have the opportunity to address the Sierra Club. And he showed up a couple of days later with that sign, pregnant woman of color, holding her child in the shadow of the incinerator, and he also gave us the first $250 check. And I took that check tearfully and I thanked him. I said it showed with that check and his action, I said he redeemed his race to me. I said, listen brother, I want to thank you for this. I took that check because we need that money for the lawsuit. But I made a promise to him that I would become a member of, upon winning, and I said, and we will win. I said, I will become a member of the Sierra Club. And I promised to join that organization and transform its culture to making it one of the most diverse, inclusive, and racially empowering organizations. And that has been my tenure as president of the Sierra Club. And helping it being one of the biggest financiers of the People's Climate March, and the two climate marches, and making sure, and this is the thing we talked about, stepping up and stepping back. It was not the Sierra Club and its banners, its numbers. It became the platform that empowered communities of color and the youth of our community. So you don't see their brand, you see the people and being a people's movement. And real quick, what happened to my daughters, they're okay. My oldest one was 10th in her class at West Point. She's going to be commissioned major next month. My other daughter, she's a captain right here. She's attending Georgetown in communication. So the girls are all right. Thank you. Thank you for indulging me going over.